Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. Apologies for my slight tardiness. You can blame Transport for London for how long it took me to get in here. I'm very pleased today that we have Vice Admiral Peter Hudson. It's something I've wanted to do for some time, to have Allied Maritime Commander come in to talk about the unification of NATO's Maritime Command, what that means for the organisation, its operations, and therefore wider stability within Europe. Vice Admiral Hudson is a very accomplished and seasoned officer, both at sea but also in staff as well, so I'm sure he'll be able to deliver a winning presentation for the first 20 minutes, which will set us up very well for a conversation afterwards. So we'll make it relatively informal, so we can have a longer conversation and as fruitful a conversation as we can afterwards. So with that, I will leave it up to Admiral Hudson.
Can we turn this off? Do we need this?
No, put it off.
How do we do that? I'll leave it to you. Well, thanks very much. I think I've met most of you. I do, because you work for me. I think most of you. And I thought what we could do here is just run through for the next sort of 15 minutes a few bullets that I've put down. And then we can talk about any aspect of NATO Maritime, NATO, anything you want really. We'll go down rabbit holes. Some people describe them as bison holes. We'll go and, off-piste, whatever you want. So I'm quite happy to chat from a NATO perspective. But as you heard, I run the Maritime Command at Northwood. For those of you who are not familiar with the Maritime Command, it fell out of the ACO reform, which was agreed at Lisbon in 2010, ratified in Chicago in 12, and then came to life at the end of 2012, certainly as Northwood stood up as the first single maritime command, and our colleagues in Naples closed down and shut down as an entity in the summer of this year. So we are it. There is no other repository for maritime expertise in NATO. There's no little backroom staff that you can go to and chat about maritime policy. It's largely Northwood. So we cover everything from command of operations through to advising, shape and Brussels on the future of maritime policy, down to the tactical issues of what you do with 9 pirates on board a Danish ship in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So it's all spanned. So I'll run through those. I suppose, as always, the place to begin is with the strategic situation that the Alliance confronts today, and the trends that are underway, the growing relevance of maritime power in meeting NATO's goals and tasks. And of course, we all know in this room that NATO exists to ensure collective defence, to provide deterrence from attack, credible crisis management capability, and promote cooperation with its partners across the globe. And I have to say it's been remarkably successful at that over the last 60 odd years. However, in all of these fields, as we well know, the strategic landscape continues to shift, and especially so in the last few years. And I would contend that the direction of that strategic movement plays into a maritime environment for NATO, a seascape, if we could, as we look at the strengths that maritime can deliver to NATO in the years ahead. Perhaps I should ask you what's changed in the strategic area. You'd know better than I. We know very well Cold War's now being put to bed, but I think probably the post-Cold War era as well. If you look at Jim Stavridis' comments when he was the last SACEUR, he used to talk about NATO 1.0, 2.0 and 3.0, and it's the 3.0 which was the post-Cold War era, after that aspect. Of course, that was defined by US unipolarity, strong economic growth, ethnic conflicts on the fringe of the sort of post-Soviet Eurasia, the rise of jihadist terrorism exemplified by Al-Qaeda, land wars in the Balkans, in Iraq, Afghanistan, an exhausting campaign of stabilization, reconstruction and counterinsurgency over 2 decades. Sometime near the end of the last decade, last 3 or 4 years, the centre of gravity shifted. The ethnic Eurasian disputes are pretty calm at the moment, or remain contained, if I can put it that way. The 2008 sort of Russian-Georgian conflict was the last outbreak of any hostilities within the European area, and there are none on the horizon as far as I can see. The Iraq intervention is over. NATO is busy transitioning ISAF to a training mission, Resolute Support, which will be complete by the end of 2014. Terrorism, I suppose, has been on the retreat since 2007, with a few notable exceptions. And the Arab Spring gave a very different, more populist twist to pressures for change in the Middle East. And these continue to be seen, as you know, in Syria and within the Gulf. Economic power, political influence is tilting away from the post-1918 transatlantic model. We all know our UK's Prime Minister in China today. China, India, Brazil emerged as major powers. Russia has returned to a prominent position especially in the world of geopolitics, and new disputes on WMD proliferation, contested maritime claims in the Pacific, disruptions to shipping of goods and energy resources in the form of piracy off Somalia, increasingly the Gulf of Guinea, and especially the explosion of unrest in the Arab world that led to the Libyan conflict and the ongoing Syrian war. The littoralization of the world's populations, the migration towards the coastal regions, will concentrate security challenges adjacent to the sea and is a major factor in NATO's maritime thinking. So there is no doubt that a credible collective security apparatus is required and will continue to be essential. Now, many of these challenges have a maritime resonance, which is my point. The limits of long-term coin operations and the desire from politicians now to limit, not avoid, but to limit the boots on the ground is leading to a greater emphasis on air and sea alternatives within NATO, particularly when action is required, and we saw that potentially in Libya. Personally, I think it's just as dangerous to rule out that analogy of avoiding placing boots on the ground as it is to insist on them. We need to be careful that we take away the correct lessons from campaigns like Afghanistan. What is not in doubt is the re-emergence of international adherence to rules-based authority exerted by bodies such as the United Nations, and that is especially the case within NATO countries. We may well have coalitions from within the NATO alliance and with nations beyond. However, the might of the alliance as an entity will, I think, in future be founded solely on UN Security Council resolutions and very well-defined legal frameworks. This means that NATO requires environments where influence and authority can be demonstrated in advance of these UN Security Council resolutions, where presence can aid decision-making and prepare future operating frameworks. Maritime power possesses a distinctive utility which is unmatched by land and air forces for those types of outcomes. Now, as we shift out of this current ground campaign, NATO will need to retain extensive situational awareness of potential crises, the ability to stage forces, demonstrate interest, resolve issues without crossing national boundaries. This will be within and indeed beyond NATO's traditional AOR. Introspection for NATO at this stage would be unhelpful. NATO will keep its presence in those areas of the world where security threats to the alliance emanate, which of course includes the Indian Ocean region. We will seek to shape a battle space and understand the regional dynamics, deepen partnerships and communications links, support international community efforts to contain conflicts, to engage with global partners, so often best done in neutral space, in particular when that partnership is new or has not matured, and significantly to signal the alliance's presence, relevance and resolve. Now, throughout NATO will hope to maintain the means to deliver striking power and the ability to make an initial entry into a hostile territory if required. Now, our maritime forces address all of these goals, some of them uniquely. And NATO's standing forces, which I run, form the bulk of NATO's immediate reaction force. It's the alliance's first responder to crisis. So we have this context, this capability already embedded in our institutions. So that's a fine vision, and you would expect me to say that as an admiral, and we'll be promoting it within the alliance in the run-up to September's NATO summit here in Cardiff. Is it realistic? I would say so. Are there challenges to it? Undoubtedly. And let's have a look at some of those. First of these, I might just touch on our current two operations, which are Active Endeavour and Ocean Shield. Active Endeavour, as you know, is a counter-terrorism mission in the Mediterranean, which has been an Article 5 operation running now for 12 years. In fact, I think we're about to start our 13th year soon. We have to review how long we continue with this Article 5 operation. Should NATO's maritime forces continue to try and catch anomalies in shipping behaviour in the hope of identifying a terrorist, or should we work alongside the regional authorities in the Mediterranean region and respond to cued intelligence or a threat working alongside national authorities? OAE has been a substantial success for engaging with partners. We have deep relationships with nations like Russia, with Ukraine, with Israel, with Morocco and so on, both at sea and in the way we exchange information between those entities. It has contributed enormously to the security apparatus of the Mediterranean, but how do we take it forward? And that is a debate we're having in Brussels at the moment. I believe it's ripe for fundamental overhaul. For Ocean Shield, we need to deal with the fruits of success in the Indian Ocean. Not having had a hijacking in the Horn of Africa since May 2012, it would be tempting to wind up the mission. But we know that the danger is not fully past. The pirate business model may be done, but it's not out. Even so, should we look at NATO's posture in the Indian Ocean? Should we continue to follow catchapirate.com, or should we engage in broader regional engagement and do more work with our partners and allies in the region? What about capacity building? What about a shift to the Gulf of Guinea, as some people propose? Would that be effective? Should our presence in the Indian Ocean be full-time, or should we be part-time? Does the Indian Ocean still matter to NATO? So again, another debate which is running through Brussels at the moment, which we can explore. But just looking at that broader perspective on the utility of maritime power, a key objective of our shift to a prepared NATO, a contingent NATO, is to exercise and bring to readiness our capability for proper, complex, integrated military operations. And that requires complex exercises which NATO has not been delivering over the last few years. Now, there are two challenges which I just want to touch on. The external challenge for the maritime is the changing face of war at sea in the 21st century. You again know as well as I do, new standoff, anti-access weapons, anti-ship ballistic missiles pose substantial challenges for littoral operations. Remember where the populations are. It complicates strike and amphibious work as well. New navies are rising that have first-rate capabilities, so the assumption that NATO will dominate sea and airspace in a future conflict could be questioned and could be debated. Threats such as cyber attacks can threaten ships just as easily as institutions and installations ashore. We may not have enough ships and aircraft to do what we want, insufficient funds to operate them. I suppose national force structures are changing, maritime structures, with a decline in traditional general-purpose vessels, a shift to power projection-capable ships and air warfare platforms. But nevertheless, as daunting as some of those challenges are, alliance nations are moving ahead with operational solutions to address them, and we in MARCOM will help. The internal challenge may be more difficult of the two for NATO, and that's the growing reticence of allies to overtly embrace the strategic utility of maritime power, a reluctance best exemplified by ever-lowering national contributions to NATO's standing forces, sometimes as little as one ship in a group. But they also disconnect the balance between political commitment to NATO and the actual manifestation of that through hard warfighting capabilities to the standing groups. Now, the reasons for this are understandable. Financial austerity has left little funding for deployments. Some navies, like the US, UK, France, Germany, Italy, come to mind, have considerable national tasking for operational deployments, and they offer excellent training and exercises of their own. I suppose there's still a bit of competition between the EU and NATO for scarce naval assets. The frigates and mine hunters and the standing naval forces have, by and large, over the last decade, been employed in the narrower remit of maritime interdiction and counter-piracy operations, constabulary work. The two operations currently underway are long duration and are not very attractive to most contributors, and we need to look at those. So it's time to rethink this attitude of standing naval forces, as well as the ways in which NATO makes contributions to that immediate response force. To begin with, we all draw too great a distinction between national and formal NATO activity, especially at sea. Everybody hankers for units under their command. Ships engaged on national tasking for whatever nation are still part of the alliance, are still part of NATO. They uphold the values and strive to enhance NATO's objectives, albeit delivered through a national program. They and the nations that deploy them continue to benefit from collective defence, most trained to and operate at NATO standards. Thus, national or multilateral exercises also strongly support our objectives. We've developed a new approach to associated support. Don't commit formally, join us, and in an associated manner to contribute to NATO business, and this works well in the Mediterranean. So that linkage between national activity, national training, NATO readiness needs to be better captured and leveraged over the next few years. For instance, the UK Response Task Force task group designed to be built around carriers, amphibious platforms, nuclear submarines and so on, and now has contribution from allies, looks a lot like a full spectrum maritime task force that NATO would want at a time of crisis. Could it not take on that role during part of its deployment, intertwining NATO and national activities, but always on call if NATO and the nation, UK and the Allies, decide to commit to a NATO operation? Could not the UK-French-led Combined Joint Expeditionary Force, the US Carrier Strike Group in the Gulf, or the Spanish-Italian Amphibious Force do similar associated work for NATO? Instead of sending forces to strategic seas to be on call or exercise with partners, could we not better leverage the Allied forces that are already there? Why are we not designing exercises in the Indian Ocean? We need to look at that. I believe the benefits of closer linkage would be considerable for NATO and the contributing nations. All of our allies have called for greater presence and capability, and improved engagement and strategic signalling, all of them through the NATO mechanism. And this can be achieved in a rational way with reasonable costs. And it mostly requires seeing national and NATO roles not as separate spheres of activity, but as complementary and supportive of each other. So, the sea is a manoeuvre space which affords unparalleled flexibility, political freedom. It sustains forces for protracted periods across enormous capability spectrums. It needs to re-emerge within NATO thinking as the environment of authority within this ever-dynamic world. Someone once said, the world is littered with the wreckage of nations who forgot their dependence upon the sea. I'd now like to open up. We can go down, as I say, any rabbit holes or any bison holes. Perhaps I could ask by asking you a question. What maritime activities you think should have priority for the Alliance, and what should we do to achieve those? It's a leading question.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Christian?
Yes, indeed. That's an excellent and very concise overview of NATO currently and potentially NATO in the future as a maritime power. I'm interested in both the aspects of potential expansion or shift in geographical scope as well as functional scope.
Yep.
But also, a key point you highlighted there, I think, is the shift in cultural attitude required internally within NATO, which is an organisation that has been focused on the land for 6 to 7 decades now. Is there a chance for it to become more maritime focused or more sea focused in that way? And you would know much more about that than I would, but I think there are various challenges to that actually occurring, and I wonder whether the current maritime focus is a temporary status until the next major land campaign comes about. But let's open up to the floor. If you could say your name and affiliation before the Admiral answers, that would help them greatly. Let's start with Nick Charles.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks, Admiral. Nick Charles from the BBC. Yeah, I'd like to pick up first on the sort of geographical horizons. As you hinted in your talk, the centre of gravity of a lot of strategic issues are moving ever eastwards. You mentioned the Indian Ocean several times. Raised questions about whether NATO has an enduring commitment there. But I was wondering how far do your geographical horizons reach? I mean, could you envisage a NATO task force sailing around the East China Sea, for example, or South China Sea, or further east, where real maritime issues and the rising maritime force levels are perhaps most situated?
Well, the honest answer is yes, at some stage. Now the question, I can't say when, but yes, at some stage. Somalia is a good example. NATO got embroiled in, and that's the wrong phrase, but NATO got engaged in the counter-piracy operation when its standing maritime group had cleared through the Suez Canal and was outbound to Australia and up to Singapore and up to Japan to do some work in the South China Seas, and that's where the SNMG was going at the time, with 8 ships to go and work with partners which we have developed through operations in Afghanistan, of Australia, Japan, all sorts of good Korea that we've got good strong relations with in the area, and NATO thought, well, let's go and do some work with them, and then it got starboard 15, stay off Somalia, and we're still there. So that philosophy of building, nurturing, championing partnerships through maritime forces is still enshrined in our guidance. And SACURE provides me with strategic guidance every year on what I should do with the schedules. And one of the things I want to achieve with Ocean Shield is to lift it from a single operational focus, which is piracy, broaden its remit so we can do cooperative security with nations like Australia, who are in the Indian Ocean, New Zealand in the Indian Ocean, Korea, Japan, Russia, lots of nations in the Indian Ocean. Well, let's go and do some work with them. Let's do some capability training, always able to shift back to piracy if required. And if the trends continue, for the next year or so off Somalia, and we see a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel in Mogadishu in terms of institutional reform, then yes, I'd like to get back to spreading NATO's wings and going to work with those partners in the southeast. Would I see a permanent presence there? No, not at the moment. But certainly going there to work with them and build partnerships and do capability training, yes, at some stage in the future.
I'm Carl Holmes, the German Defense Attaché, Naval Attaché from the German Embassy. Admiral, you mentioned Cougar, the Cougar series, and that other nations are contributing to this series.
Yep.
And we have now the idea of the framework nation concept.
Yep.
Does that fit together? Could you comment on that and bring that a little bit together so that we can imagine what could be a framework nation concept for NATO?
Well, we're now working this with the Assistant Secretary General Operations in Brussels. We can continue, and we had the Maritime Commanders Conference in London a week or so ago, and Sakio came, and he was very bullish in his berating of nations for not providing ships to standing forces. I know Germany is a strong contributor, but we continue this year after year after year, and we don't make much progress. Well, stop banging our head against the wall. Let's have a look at other entities that exist in the maritime domain and see whether there's a mechanism by which NATO can link these two. Now, I would propose through ASG Ops that as part of the maritime strategy paper for the summit, that we ought to look at the standing naval forces in a broader way than perhaps Andreas did, Andreas Krauss, who worked for me. Why is it that we've got very strong institutions like the European Amphibious Initiative, the UK-French, the Cougar programme, the German task group, Belgian, Dutch groups? Is there a way where we can put these on associated linkages to NATO in a more formal manner than just the reserve, the response force pool, which is the current bit of the NRF? Could we invite a nation, you mentioned Cougar, like the UK, to provide that leadership through its C group, a la Strike Force NATO, be a sort of RN, RAF, command team that could serve? Those are the sort of themes which I think would buy us more intellectual thinking than just bang our heads, say, give me another frigate, give me another MCMV, because it's not working at the moment. So that's where we can do it. And there are lots of these groupings around the NATO institutions, and we ought to look at how we tag them.
You mentioned looking beyond the SNMGs. Do you mean that SNMGs won't be the heart of future maritime cooperation with NATO, or even you might even do away with them because it's such a bind to actually have commitments to standing groups?
At the moment, I don't see any desire or appetite, and I don't want to get rid of the SNMGs. But we need to have a credible immediate response force, a reaction force for NATO. And at the moment, the current model is not providing it. So we continue with the current model, or you can try something different. So that's why we'll have, whichever we come up with, we have to have something that NATO can deploy at short notice to a potential crisis from the maritime side.
Andrew Brooks.
Andrew Brooks, can I talk about maritime patrol aircraft, Admiral?
Yeah.
We got rid of ours, and there doesn't seem to be any great appetite for leasing P8s, even though the Indians are getting them, etc., etc.
Yeah.
What's the NATO view on this? Because I know everybody in Britain thinks, we'll rely on allies, but everybody's relying on allies.
Yeah.
Have you got a line? Has NATO got a line on the deficiencies and the gaps and the long-term threats?
There's a dull thing called the NATO Defence Planning Process, the NDPP, which is run by ACT. And that looks across the capability fields that NATO as an alliance would require to deliver a balanced force and an MJO, a major joint operation plus. So something like Afghanistan is a major joint operation. And they look across fields. And for the maritime area, maritime patrol aircraft, persistent wide area surveillance gets flagged up every time in the top 15 capabilities that NATO sees as being eroded. MCM is another one, mine countermeasures is another one that's being chipped away at. ASW, and I mentioned to it earlier, nations are drifting towards power projection platforms. They're cheap, they're big, they're totemic, they quite like them. And air warfare systems, because they believe that the dominance of the air battle space allows you to do easier access into theatres. And you can see that in many nations across Europe, the reliance on air warfare platforms. So NATO has flagged up the lack of MPA, the lack of wide area surveillance in its top 15. I can't remember what it is on the list. It's about number 7. And it's asked a nation to lead the debate on how we can champion it. I think that nation's the UK. So I think in answering your question, yes, NATO recognises it and is extolling the nations to do something about it. It can't direct, it can't order, it identifies. And I know from my own job, and this is getting down to parochial for the UK perspective, that in the next SDSR we will just have to have another look, and we will do, about the lack of wide area surveillance. And from a Royal Navy and Air Force perspective, it's right up there near the top of capabilities that we both feel profoundly the absence of. So yes, you're right. You just can't wander around today. The Dutch have downscaled it, the French are downscaling. We've got rid of ours. Even though the US are getting P8s, they're not matching them 1-for-1, so there's a shorter number of aircraft, fewer aircraft. So it is a worry. It is a worry.
Jason.
Jason Alder, MBDA. Adam, can I be a bit more direct and follow on from Nick's question? And specifically, you opened up about the need for consensus and operating in a rules-based environment, whether that's domestically, nationally, through NATO or internationally.
Yep.
So specifically about the air defence identification zone in the South China Sea, what's your kind of view on the challenge to those norms, and indeed whether or not there should be a NATO response or not? That's my first question. And my second question, yeah, nice one. Soft one. And my second one would be looking at sort of more broader, more maritime roles. What's the sort of current thinking about BMD and the maritime role for BMD and NATO specifically?
Could I just intervene quickly and say, if you want to completely off the record, you can just say that's fine.
Well, this is off the record because I think there are two aspects. South China Sea is a good example, and it's not for me to say what NATO should or shouldn't do with the South China Sea. It's outside our AOR. It's not within my parish. But those sort of little tweaks of international norms and international legislation for national reasons are just the sorts of things which I think will drive NATO ever more towards the authority of the UN. And you saw the confusion, wrong word, but over Syria. The various nations looking about what we should or should not do with Syria when a red line is crossed. Now, one of NATO's great strengths is that there are 28 nations in it, and when they put their shoulder behind the wheel, boy, it's an impressive beast. And just look at, Afghanistan, when they roll out, it's very, very impressive. One of NATO's great weaknesses is that there are 28 members in NATO, and they all have a voice. And you saw those range of voices in Syria, from left of arc, very strong commitments from one or two nations, and much less so from others. Now, how you bring that beast together to say we all agree becomes increasingly complex. So, on the back of that, then I think that reliance on UN Security Council resolutions to say that is the international view, and NATO then can sign it, is going to be a trend for NATO. So, from a Syria perspective, God forbid one was to see something awful happen in that country, more than it is at the moment. Let's say the chemical weapons inspectors were all taken hostage by one part or the other. There is no doubt there will be an international outcry, and the UN would probably put its shoulder behind the wheel. That is the sorts of things that NATO then say, right, we see the thing, let's see where NATO would get engaged. With regards to the South China Sea, until you get that sort of unified view from within the UN, and then the UN invites an organisation like NATO to uphold it, it isn't going to go there. But NATO, do you get my point?
Yeah.
It would sort of see it. Now with BMD, notwithstanding a NATO planning process and the 15 top capabilities, the headline capabilities for NATO at the moment, as exemplified in Chicago, are cyber, and what NATO should do in both fields of cyber defence, and what that means to Article 5, and what that means to military and institutions in nations, and also what we should do and how we should bring it into warfare as a whole. What we do with cyber, and BMD was the other package. And of course, the current threat from Syria to an alliance member, Turkey, which has required a BMD response in terms of protection zone, has brought it right back into the spotlight. So I think, again, off the record, the BMD will retain its profile at the Cardiff summit next year, and will be one of the capabilities which, again, will be championed. Now, from the maritime, we know the US are stationing 4 BMD units in Rota. They will provide a presence in the Mediterranean for not just NATO, but also national and some of their bilateral agreements that the US have. And whilst those platforms are adapted to do multi-spectrum warfare rather than just sensor-shooter work well, then NATO will be invited to provide support to them, which we will do. And nations within NATO are Germany, France, Italy, Dutch, are looking at how their air warfare platforms can play more into the BMD sphere. So I think there will be a continuing trend towards the maritime dimension. I think the club that fulfills the TBMD role within the maritime will grow over the next few years, and that I think is a very welcome capability upgrade for NATO, particularly given some of the threats. If you look at the Eastern Med, if NATO has a view in the Gulf, if NATO has a view in Straits of Hormuz, if NATO has, there are lots of these BMD threats that would apply to a NATO machine.
Can I just follow up on the issue of NATO in Asia? I mean, you said that NATO is increasingly following the UN, but isn't it also true that NATO necessarily has to follow the US? And given the US is pivoting to Asia, could NATO not be dragging there?
Well, that doesn't mean to say that the US will say that's the end of an Atlantic relationship with Europe. The huge amounts of trade, political. I mean, Europe and America are inextricably linked. Yes, the US is concentrated is the wrong word, but reprioritizing towards the Pacific. I mean, the maritime, it's one carrier group which goes back to the Pacific that was moved to the Atlantic by Clinton about 16 years ago, so it's rebalancing back that way. But on the back of that, you see Aegis destroyers moving into the Mediterranean. So from the maritime perspective, it's not as profound as it is in the land and the air from the maritime side. But yes, you're right. We have to acknowledge, and the US, 78% of NATO's capability, 72% of its forces come from the United States as an institution. And you've seen the various, Secretary Hagel and all the rest of them saying it's time for Europe to stop drawing on NATO security and start contributing to NATO security. So hence my point about these framework links for European maritime institutions like the Cougar Group, like UK French, like European Amphibious, like Spanish Italy Amphibious groups. They need greater profile in NATO to give a bit of a balance between US and Europe. So I don't see America certainly isn't abandoning NATO. It's just there's a reprioritization, but not a sort of dash to the door. Yeah, Ben. Yeah.
Can I ask you something a bit more about maritime capability?
Yeah.
Because the war in Libya seems to me quite instructive, in that there was a quite considerable maritime dimension which was perhaps underreported.
Yeah.
With mine countermeasures, with ISTAR from the sea, with air control. But it also seemed to me that it highlighted some capability gaps. Precision fire at land targets from the sea. Lots of old-fashioned naval gunfire, but not a single precision round fired from a destroyer or a frigate. And similarly, a lack of UAV capability at sea. And it's quite interesting to compare that capability with land capability, because Iraq and Afghanistan mean that army battalions and brigades now are equipped with considerable amounts of precision land, indirect firepower, and considerable numbers of UAV. And I wonder if the maritime component slipped behind, and also it's become over-fixated on manned aircraft and manned helicopters at the expense of unmanned systems.
I would agree. Let's see why that is. I'll speak again from from my own experience in the UK, which is typical, I suspect, across NATO and other nations have it. Now, there has been a drive, there has been a national focus across many NATO nations on the complexities of Afghanistan. What do we say in the UK, main effort, for the UK? And as a nation, we were not alone in doing that. A lot of nations putting a huge amount of resource, both human capability and financial resource, into a very complex operation. And that has driven all sorts of changes. If you looked at the relationship between the land and air components in 2002, when we started, it is radically different to where it is now, for all the reasons that you say, which has been driven by the complexities of that theatre. I think the maritime sector has sat behind that change. There's been a natural focus on getting that operation right. And some of those doctrinal changes, that linkage between the air environment, between ISTAR, what we do in a joint context, have not translated and resonated into the maritime area as we would like. So those fields that you mentioned, UAVs and ability to deploy them from ships, only now are nations starting to get engaged in that. I know the US is slightly ahead of us in some context, but most of the other nations, UK in one, France, Germany, Italy, are now looking at what we can do with UAVs from sea. The UK, we've managed to get some UAVs at sea in the Gulf. They're the wrong ones, but it gets the door open to start debating on how we can bring it in. And our new frigate, the Type 26, will have a UAV capability built into it. NGS, of course, for maritime navies was always there to suppress troops on the ground. And those guns were designed to support amphibious operations and all sorts of other things. The precision that you get in a 4.5-inch gun or a 76mm gun is not what we would want by comparison to Afghanistan. So again, the UK, we will look to put a 5-inch gun on Type 26 with precision munitions within it to do just that thing. So there is a bit of a catch-up. We are several years behind the forcing environment that Afghanistan has delivered into the land and air communities and driving the two of them together. And the maritime has done so. But as we come back, and I genuinely think we'll come back into the centre of NATO's thinking, then those sorts of capabilities will rise in prominence. And I certainly see it in my own nation, and I would be surprised if it was not the case in other major navies around Europe. I think that's true. So we'll work on that. I think with regards to the other aspects, the MCM were very good, ISTAR, air controls and so on. And getting back to my point about the immediate response force, that little theatre entry group, MCM vessels and frigates, are not going to solve the Libya campaign in their own right. But they do start shaping the battle space, whilst that machine that is Brussels winds itself up with the initiating directive, get to know plan, does the force generation, gets the assets from nations. So that's why the IRF is quite important for NATO, and the MCM in particular, making a secure space. So MCM is a jewel for NATO, which we want to preserve, and getting credible IRF, whether it's through national framework entities or through dedicated NATO units, is something we need to preserve as well.
You mentioned the tension might be the wrong word, but the balance between EU and NATO requirements for European countries. Yeah. Is there a sense that, given the desire of both the EU and NATO to draw upon maritime assets, there should be a division in function, so that for instance EU forces might be focused more on maritime security operations and NATO on warfighting operations?
Well, they're the same forces.
Yeah.
You don't go to France and say, can I see your EU force and can I see your NATO force? They're the same ships that do both. And of course the EU is working hard at finalising what it terms its maritime strategy for the EU. We have one in NATO. NATO is a military-based maritime strategy which looks at collective defence, etc., etc. Maritime security operations, critical infrastructure, maritime interdiction, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, all those sort of things that you would expect from a maritime force. The EU is much broader. It's environmental, it's got tax, it's got customs, all those things that you would expect in an EU maritime strategy. Because the word security is in one week and out the next. So a maritime strategy. And that requires different forces. Now I happen to welcome it because one of our observations from Mediterranean operations is the linkage between coast guards and navies, between NGOs, police forces, the aircraft, the shipping industry, is not good in some areas. It's radically different. It's getting better, but a EU maritime strategy would drive those together in a much more formal manner, which would allow the harder, if I can use that phrase, NATO operations like Active Endeavour to dock with them in a neater fashion than we do at the moment. So I welcome it, but it's the same ship, whether it's flying a flag for EU in the Indian Ocean or a flag for NATO in the Indian Ocean. It comes from the same national force, and we need to make sure we complement each other and don't get competitive. And I think, Somalia, people talk about the competition between the EU, and I mentioned it briefly myself. But if you have one ship to deploy, which is increasingly the view from a lot of NATO nations, and you look at the European Union, who can drive money, that's the main thing, they've got dosh, and can do things in places like Somalia, it is much more attractive to your public to say, my ship as part of a national support of rebuilding Somalia, that we're supporting financially, we're doing institutional reform, we're training policemen, we're still catching pirates, is quite a nice package to the public. it's not quite as clear from the NATO side, which is why we need to say to those nations, yes, that is a very legitimate operation, it needs to be delivered. But at a time of sort of financial constraints, at a time of challenges around the world, security is delivered through NATO, and we need to just make sure the balance is right between constabulary, low risk, low threat operations and retaining a credible response to a threat, and that or the response to a invitation from the UN to do something. So that's where it is, and I think we've missed that over the last few years in the maritime. Haven't done enough of it. Yeah. Good.
Can I just follow up
Yeah.
on that? Because the whole maritime capability thing, because it's the same ships. By and large, there's certainly a lot of overlap in terms of it's the same countries.
Yeah.
And it's certainly in the context of the European maritime capabilities future, there has been this issue around where the focus should be on high end. Should it be on the high end, being able to take on a maritime competitor at sea versus the maritime security investments? And you mentioned that's where you get power projection, you get ships that are able to take on the pirates, maybe, but maybe less battle hardened for future future maritime operations. Is that actually a sort of dividing point, among people's concepts of where NATO should go?
People say we go high end. Who are we going to go high end with? But I was in Israel last week actually, when the standing group was in Israel, a couple of the NATO ships there, and we went to do some staff talks. And of course, they reminded me that a few years ago they intercepted a series of missiles which were inbound to, I think, somewhere in the Gaza Strip or somewhere. They reminded me that one of their ships got hit by a very complex missile fired off the back of a truck during their operations in Lebanon. They reminded me that, and they just keep going on. So there are some very complex systems around in the hands of some fairly loosely organised bodies, and that's just at the sort of, the sort of non-nation state type bodies. So how do you then preserve a maritime environment that would allow you to, do humanitarian support to refugees in an area who are suffering from X, Y, and Z, and NATO decides it would go and the alliance members would go and do something about it when you've got threats on the periphery? Well, to counter those sort of missiles, it's complex ECM, it's complex sort of intelligence, it's complex missile systems that allow you to hold a space. So I would just caution against. We can do maritime security, we can do constabulary, we can do low end, and there's no need, because these things are all over the shop. I mean, the Army, just look at the impact of fairly straightforward IEDs in Afghanistan a few years ago and how it completely changed the way we did operations in that country. Well, it's just as complex in the maritime. So and you would say that the response to that has now ended up with pretty high-end capabilities to counter that IED threat. From what is pretty unsophisticated, I mean that in the nicest sense, system. So we need to be careful about that. And again, I get back to my earlier point about if you've got a literalized world with, I don't know what the numbers are, I think someone says 21 of the 25 mega cities are adjacent to the sea or within a small number of miles of the sea. I think it's only Mexico City, Moscow, Peking, and got the fourth one, that are not immediately accessible by the sea. If these are the areas where security threats are going to emerge, when you've got 18 million people in Lagos, down there in Nigeria, then those high-end systems that Ben talked about, whether it's ISTAR, whether it's UAVs, whether it's complex precision, whether it's the ability to insert in a very secure and safe manner, are not the threats that get exercised when you're chasing pirates or just delivering low-end constabulary operations. So we've got to get the balance right. That doesn't mean to say that NATO says we're not interested in operations, because we need to go and keep our skills up. We've just got to make sure that we don't put all our efforts into one, and if we are doing so, we see how else we can retain the edge on our sword, so to speak. So I think those threats will grow, and they will be increasingly complex and more diverse, and therefore your systems need to be able to counter them if you were to have access and freedom of manoeuvre that you want to do some of the outputs that maritime can deliver. Is that all right, Nick? Was that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, no, I know that's a good answer.
We've got two more over here. We'll start with Jason.
Yeah.
Admiral, can I be a bit more parochial and ask a more industrial?
That's unlike you, mate.
An industrial-based question, really. I mean, how exercised are you? Look, if you took the US out of the NATO equation from a maritime industrial capacity, and you look at Europe, and you can broadly say there's quite a lot of oversupply in terms of industrial capability of maritime dimension. Obviously, it's a very national-driven issue. You know, my shipbuilding industry, my industrial capability. Do you get a sense of, given where we are financially and the growing commitments, that there's a desire to really look at the industrial base as a whole, whether it be maritime or in the air sector or whatever, that there's political momentum to sort of start to address, if you like, oversupply, so we get more economies of scale, we drive more efficiencies?
Well, I think that's been the case for the last sort of 25 years, is it not? You know, trying to rationalise and streamline the industrial process. No. And I spoke at, and NATO has an industry forum. There's a defence agency, industrial agency that works with NATO. It had a conference a couple of weeks ago in Istanbul, where you had all the chief executives from the big companies across Europe. You know, EADS was there, and BAE and Raytheon, all the big companies there, Finmeccanica and so on, all saying just what you said. You know, we need to make sure we understand your capability requirements, and we don't duplicate, and we don't compete, and get the right balance, the bang for the buck, all that sort of stuff. But there seems to be stasis in making it happen. Now, it's not for me as a NATO operational commander to dictate or give a view on what those big industrial entities should or should not do. You've seen it in the UK, you saw it a few years ago when there was potential alliance between some of the big European companies with national views on what should or should not happen. I'll leave it to the capitals. I can't order that. All we can do from a NATO entity and say these are the sort of capabilities which we think an alliance ought to be able to field in the key environments. You nations need to sort of look at those, reflected in your own national strategies, and see how it's done. But whether it's the EU and what they call pooling and sharing in capabilities, or NATO and smart defence, you know, they're all the same themes of just trying to make sure we rationalise and keep these tight. But national agendas will always sort of bubble very quickly to the top in these things, and you know, we just need to be alive to those. But NATO is not in a position to say thou should do X, Y, or Z. You know, we can make observations, not me, but Secretary General can, and see how it takes it. But we do have a good dialogue with industry, and we do sort of outline the capabilities, and we do try. Of course, we work with nations to do it. How it's discharged on the ground is not really our business. But we do work very well with the European Defence Agency as well, EDA and the NATO team, to make sure that we're not sort of diverging. Because again, 22 of the 28 sit in both camps.
Can I just follow on from Jason's point? Are you under any pressure with dockyards, Portsmouth, all that sort of dimension? Under any pressure to come up with cheap and cheerful Corvette type things just to keep skills base going?
Well, you're sort of drifting into national as opposed to NATO in that business. I mean, we can maybe talk about national over a cup of tea later on, but from a NATO perspective, I'm sorry to be sort of a bit dull on this because I sound like a bit cracked record. NATO's strength is the nations, the 28 nations who contribute their force structure through whatever means. It is up to those nations to decide their force mix. And as I mentioned earlier, in the maritime sector, and you see the same with air and with land, there are trends away from capabilities that those three environments would want to deploy in a major operation, you know, an existential threat to NATO. ASW is going down in NATO, mine warfare, some of those broader skills, MPA, which you alluded to. There's a sort of drift towards complex air warfare platforms to you know, LPDs and the Mistral type ships that you see around NATO now across the piece. And it's the same in land and air. So we've just got to say to nations, if that's the way your force structure is going, that's your call, nation. If you want to go and get corvettes as opposed to destroyers, if you want to go and buy Land Rovers as opposed to mine-resistant whatever vehicles, then that's your call. But this is what we will not be able to do as an alliance if you want to call upon it. and that's our, and that's what we just keep badgering every year. And we present it on a 12-monthly basis. ACT in Norfolk corrals all that data, much as the DCD does in the UK. They look at the future character. They try and work out where conflicts are going, and they say, these are the capabilities. What do you think of alliance members? And you then just have to wait and see how they respond. Corvettes are good in some instances. They're fabulous in some instances, and many of the NATO nations have ocean-going corvettes that can deliver some packages. But if you're doing a theatre entry campaign to, let's say, fight your way into the Gulf of Sirte in the Libya campaign, to put aid or troops or whatever it is into Libya, they're the ships that arrive on day 2, not day 1. And you just have to look at the balance of forces and decide how you use them, and make sure we don't do too much to day 2 and not enough on day 1.
And you mentioned briefly in your presentation the issue of the re-emergence of Russia as a maritime power and geopolitical entity. We have a Russian representative here in Igor. I wonder whether you could talk about how NATO's
maybe Igor could
how NATO's shift to sea might affect Russian NATO engagement. I mean, SecGen's already said that NATO will not have a permanent presence in the Arctic. Does that undermine NATO's ability to engage with Russia in what could be a collaborative sphere, or are there other areas that could work?
Gosh, that's a broad one. I think at the operational and tactical level, NATO maritime, Russia maritime work together extremely well. We have 4 or 5 years of cooperation in Indian Ocean, Gulf Aden, counter-piracy. We've supported each other in various incidents in the Gulf Aden. Russia is one of our active endeavour partners. We've had associated support from Russian ships. In fact, I think we've had 2 ships from Russia as active direct support in 2008, 2009. I can't remember the dates, but so in that field we work very well. We've got NATO Russian submarine search and rescue capabilities that we exercise together. We do SAR routines in places like the Baltic. We're looking at what we may do with some of the residual bits on historic ordnance that litter that sea. So at the sort of operational and tactical level, Russia and NATO work very well. I'm not going to comment on the strategic side. That's the SecGen piece. The High North, NATO is a military, political military institution. The High North, the Arctic Sea, however you describe it, circulates the top of the globe. Some nations, NATO nations, have a footprint there. Norway, Iceland is up there, Denmark, Greenland, US, Canada. And all those nations have very different views on what we should do in the High North, and where NATO, if anything, has a role. If you're in Canada, it has absolutely no role whatsoever up in the High North. The US is fairly ambivalent to it. Norway thinks we should have a presence in that site. Which is why the Secretary General is probably right. So we're not going to put permanent presence in the High North. It's not appropriate for maritime. But we have NATO partners, NATO members who we will continue to work with in the High North, and we will exercise and help them deliver their maritime security. So I think as part of that, NATO has, through the NATO Russian Council, a mechanism for shared waters between NATO members. Of course, huge coastline for Russia in the High North. How is it? We're going to do the SAR aspects that we do in the Baltic, where we have shared. What are we going to do with search and rescue and the elementary bits of maritime security, which complement both, well, not both, all the nations that border it. Arctic Council has a role. NATO members are on the Arctic Council. So I think we sit back, which is the Secretary General's view, wait for a sort of command pull, as they would say, from alliance states, and wait and see what happens. It's not an area where NATO would see, and I'm sure Russia's exactly the same. It's not a competition between NATO to dominate, or Russia or China or Canada or whoever it may be. It's changing global dynamics, the opening up of the High North, and we just need to settle down and see how security plays out over the next few years. It's not a rush to do it. I don't know how you see it, Igor, from a Russian perspective.
Maybe I'm not so representative to eliminate the Russian perspective, because we hold with you that the most offensive Russian military has his staff quarter in Brussels,
Yeah.
and supported our activity and cooperation. But in many ways, I think that those facts that we could maintain our cooperation in the sphere of counter-piracy, in the sphere of our tactical exercises,
Yep.
especially remembering that fact that many years during Cold War we couldn't chance to work together. So now I think that we will think about prolong our cooperation.
Yeah.
And you know, Admiral, that we have many ideas and many things to do.
Yeah.
How to maintain it, and especially to prevent many crisis situation in the world, counter terrorism. So I think that our navies
Yeah, I would agree.
will work together, and we should think not about not about any competition, but about more about working together.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I think the NATO-Russian Council that meets this month to look at the work schedule for 2015, we have a list of objectives and programs that between NATO and Russia we develop together, and that gets signed off in Brussels and in Moscow, and there are lots of maritime strands within it that we take forward.
It's a very heartwarming note, I think, on which to end this particular session. And I'm encouraged.
In the Arctic.
I'm encouraged because the IIS has just sent a manuscript to press on the Arctic, and what you just said did not conflict in a major way with what was in the book. So.
Oh right.
I think all that's left for us to do is really to thank you. The IIS, particularly in the run to Cardiff in September, would like to discuss more about the future of NATO, NATO's role, and particularly as a subset of that, NATO's maritime dimension. So do look forward to much more engagement and discussion of these issues, but I think this is an excellent way to open up the conversation, and I would like to ask everyone here to join me in thanking the Admiral for taking the time to do so.
Christian, thanks very much.